My name is Oliver. It's a pleasure to see everyone here today on the call. I am the Chief Operating Officer and one of the co-founders of Nucleate. For those that don't know Nucleate, I assume you're pretty familiar, but just very briefly, we're a nonprofit trying to empower the next generation of biotech leaders. We do this by providing free educational open access programming. And we like to say that, everything we do is free. But nothing in the world is free, and it's our sponsors, like namely FedSprout, that really help keep us honest and to our open access mission. And the great thing about the relationship that we have with FedSprout is not only do they sponsor Nucleate, but they've also put into play a lot of work and careful thought on their end about how can they directly support folks in the Nucleate community to help them understand better the non-dilutive funding opportunities that are out there, put together their submissions, and ultimately win that funding. So it's my pleasure to introduce Alap from FedSprout, who is their president and CEO. And I'll ask him to just briefly introduce himself and talk a little bit about what FedSprout is and how they've partnered with Nucleate. And then we can get right into the informational section of the webinar.
Thank you, Oliver. I just want to make sure that you can see my screen that I've shared.
Yes.
Wonderful. Great. Great to meet you all. My name is Alap Shah. I am the president and CEO at FedSprout, managing a team of expert SBIR, STTR proposal writers and award compliance specialists. I help a lot of entrepreneurs write their SBIR proposals, and I was a past principal investigator on several SBIR projects, primarily in the space of sensor development and robotics. Katie Bratley is a former NSF program director who unfortunately is unable to join us today. She managed a SBIR STTR portfolio at the NSF and helped contribute to the slides that we're going to go over today. So FedSprout is a nationwide consulting firm. We're helping organizations across the country access government funding and manage their awards. And it helps with our mission, which is to drive innovation in a meaningful way where there are benefits to our economy as well as our society. So today we're going to be talking about just generally the NSF SBIR STTR program. How do you go about putting in an application, what they're really looking for, and what makes a strong proposal. And we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes, hopefully at the end, to go over some questions and answers. And Oliver, I think you're going to be capturing some of the questions. I won't be able to see them during this presentation.
Yes, so just a logistical point there. As we're going through with the presentation, you guys can feel free to just drop your questions directly into the chat. And then when it's done, I'll help moderate the discussion and questions will be addressed in the order that they're asked. So feel free to just drop them in the chat and then in the Q&A portion, I'll help moderate.
Great, and I want to mention also that this is a basic webinar going over some fundamentals of the NSF SBIR STTR program. Within a week's time frame, we have another webinar that will go into more details about how to put together a competitive proposal. So the National Science Foundation supports all fields of science and engineering. They're well known for supporting and funding fundamental research and early stage innovation, and typically investing in high risk, high reward ideas that have transformative potential. Their goal is to create technologies that have a broad impact on society and the economy. And they also support translation of research to market through programs like the SBIR STTR program, which we will be talking about now. Just an introduction to what is SBIR STTR. These are congressionally mandated programs that are coordinated by the U.S. Small Business Administration. They offer non-dilutive funding, so they do not take any equity and when funding is provided to small businesses. And it's available through 11 federal agencies, out of which NSF is one agency. And the NSF has dedicated funding set aside every year to fund research and development projects. The goal of the SBIR STTR program is to spur technological innovation in a way where it meets some of the research and development needs that have been identified by our federal government, and to also support commercialization of these new technologies. So in terms of NSF SBIR STTR, the question is, how is NSF different and why does this matter? And what's different is NSF is very much focused on taking research out of the lab and bringing it into the real world. And compared to any other agency, whether it's the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, or NIH, they are focused on a much broader range of research areas. It also is the only agency that is the most friendly in terms of supporting first-time entrepreneurs and academic spinouts. So NSF is a great program, great agency. The SBIR, STTR is a great program for first-time founders. It helps you also build your credibility with future investors if you were to get funding from the NSF. And in the broader scheme of things, the NSF, SBIR, STTR awardees typically are able to fuel a large amount of economic growth and create jobs and help impact society. So who gets funded through the NSF, SBIR, STTR program? Well, it is a lot of early stage startups. 85% of awardees have five or fewer employees, and 70% plus are first time applicants to the SBIR STTR program. So if you are a small team or if you're just getting started, if you haven't incorporated, that's okay. You don't need a company to start the process for applying for funding, but you will need to set up a company when you put in your full proposal. So going into SBIR, STTR a little bit more as to what they are. SBIR stands for Small Business Innovation Research, and STTR is Small Business Technology Transfer. And there's one key difference between both of these programs. The STTR was formulated primarily to translate research from research institutions into the market. And so an SBIR is typically run by a company that has the opportunity or choice to partner with a research institution, but does not have to. An STTR, on the other hand, requires that a small business participate with a nonprofit research organization, whether an academic institution or any other type of research organization that does research and development. In terms of the work, in the SBIR program, there is a limit on how much work can be outsourced, which is 33% in phase one and 50% in phase two. For an STTR, business must perform at least 40% of the work, and the research institution has to perform at least 30%. The principal investigator has to be at the small business, regardless of SBIR or STTR, but the NSF has a requirement that in an STTR program, the research institution has to have a co-PI. So those are the three major differences between the SBIR and STTR program. A typical startup will start with the phase one, which is a 6 to 12-month project and offering a maximum of $305,000. And phase one is considered to be a feasibility project where you're really validating the scientific and technical merit of your idea, and you've just started with some of your customer discovery and you have some idea of what your market's going to look like. In a phase two, you have another 24 months and $1.25 million to refine your technology and build an enhanced prototype off of that funding. And that's also an opportunity to do more work towards developing your business model and more customer discovery. There is a new program within NSF called the Fast Track program, which is in other agencies, but it's fairly new to NSF, where you can submit a combined phase one, phase two proposal. And this actually helps to increase the pace at which you can do your project because there's a lesser waiting time between a phase two and phase two project. It's typically meant for teams that have a prior NSF research project, and they're leveraging the research completed there for a new NSF SBIR project. And it requires a lot of customer discovery and technical validation early on. And lastly, there's the phase 2B supplemental funding that can be requested. And the goal of that is to work more towards commercialization. It does require a commercialization partner that is putting in funding, and the NSF will match $1 for every $2 put in third-party investments. A lot of entrepreneurs ask this question whether they should apply to the NIH or the NSF. And the best thing to do to figure that out is really to understand the mission of both agencies. While the NIH is looking at improving public health, the NSF is looking at advancing national prosperity through science and innovation. So if you're a company that is looking to get clinical validation or at targeting a specific indication, then the NIH might be the right path for you. But if you're developing a platform technology or a software or enabler or tool that has broad applications, then the NSF might be a better fit for you. The phase one budget is almost the same, but in the phase two, the NIH provides more funding, mostly because a lot of the technologies do require more funding and take more time to develop. You are able to tweak your idea a bit to be able to fit either agency. So as an example, there was a company called Neurable that was developing a wearable EEG headset for neurorehabilitation, which would have been more of an NIH application. But what they did is they applied to the NSF and the application to develop it in a way where activity to control devices, which had a much more broader application and broader impact. So that's just an example of what you can do with a technology you're developing to fit within an agency. So let's talk about the application process. The first step is a project pitch, which is a very simple online application that allows the NSF to give you very quick feedback. It covers 4 areas: your technology innovation, your technical objectives and challenges, the market opportunity, and a description of your company and team. Once you submit a project pitch on the NSF's online form, you will get an email response. You will either be a good fit and invited to submit a full proposal, or you may get an email saying that it's not a great fit, but here's some feedback. And you have the opportunity then to take that feedback, update your pitch, and resubmit it. Once you submit a pitch, a program director at the NSF may get back to you also with some questions or comments before they make a decision whether you're a good fit or not a good fit. So the NSF works on submission windows, and you can see here on this figure, there are several submission windows. The next window closes on July 2nd, 2025. And you can submit your project pitch at any time throughout the year. You'll typically get feedback within 3 weeks. Sometimes it can be earlier and sometimes later, depending upon how busy the program directors are. And at any time, you can only have any entity that puts in a project pitch can only have one under review at a time. So let's say you were to submit your pitch today. You probably might not get feedback until early July, right after into the next submission window. What that does is that it gives you a lot of time now, because you're allowed to submit your proposal within 2 submission windows. So if you submit your proposal before November 5th, then you have that entire submission window up till November 5th, and the next one, which is March 5th of next year, to submit a full proposal. So you may want to consider strategically how you go about, or when you go about, submitting your project pitch and getting feedback, and getting your invitation to proceed, so you have sufficient time to put in that proposal. Now, in terms of full proposals, one thing to consider is that when you submit a proposal in a submission window, if you submit it at the beginning of the submission window, they're not going to review it until the end. So you can wait until you get closer to the end of the submission window to submit a proposal if you're trying to develop something that has high quality and you need more time. But remember, when you submit it, you have to submit it before the window closes. So just get there. You have to get it there in time. So one important thing that needs to be mentioned here is using AI in your project pitch. Recently, the NSF has been receiving project pitches that have been generated using large language models, and a lot of them tend to use, um, let's say, a lot of information that has been auto-generated, and the NSF does not necessarily appreciate that. What they're really looking for is your voice. They want to understand, as an entrepreneur, why did you found this company? Why are you doing this? Why are you developing technology? And why does the problem really matter to you? They want to hear your story. And our recommendation, our advice is, if you are going to use AI, use it sparingly in a way where you can help, let's say, improve your grammar or sentence structure and make it look more effective. But it's got to be a true reflection of your team is and what you're trying to do. Okay, going to the timeline for receiving funding, we sort of talked about this. Once you submit your project pitch, you can expect to receive feedback within around 3 weeks. And then it takes about 6 to 8 weeks to put a full proposal together. Once you submit it, at the end of the submission window, the review process will kick off, and you will get notification in about 3 to 6 months. So that notification will tell you whether you've been selected for award or not. Now, while 3 to 6 months is a wide range, these days there has been some staff shortages or cuts at the NSF, which is causing delays in reviewing applications. So it could take slightly more than 6 months also to receive a notification. So before you apply to the NSF, think about the timeline. What is your time frame to get funding? And think whether the government's time frame matches what you're looking to do. Okay, so let's talk about what would not be a good fit for an NSF, SBIR, STTR application. So any analytical or market studies of existing technologies, products, or services is not a good fit. Remember, the NSF is looking for you to develop something novel, something innovative. There, uh, you know, research and development that's not basic research. So if you're saying that in phase one, phase two, you're just going to focus on characterizing a novel biomarker, that would not be a fit. But instead, if you said that we're developing a prototype diagnostic device using a biomarker, that would be a better fit. The NSF does not want to fund incremental or evolutionary improvements to an existing product or service. So if you've developed a software app and you want to add a feature to that, that may not necessarily be it. Also, the NSF wants to fund projects that have a clear chance of commercial success, and they want to make a big impact on a company. They want to see success stories. They want to see huge impacts where companies are able to scale significantly. So what does NSF allow in life sciences projects? So definitely they're looking for early stage, high risk research and development, focused on preclinical feasibility. So it could be developing prototypes for diagnostics, therapeutics, devices, and it could involve in vitro, in vivo, or animal model studies. When it comes to human subjects, it is possible to do some early studies that support your feasibility or proof of concept studies. Um, but it's really important to talk to a program director just to make sure that they're comfortable with that after you submit your project pitch and get an official invitation to put in a full proposal. What's not allowed is clinical trials or anything to do with clinical implementation or clinical operations. So what does NSF look for in a funded project? So they're looking for you to do research and development in a way where you're addressing a major technical challenge or challenges. You need to propose something that's novel, proprietary, and has a clear differentiation from the competition. In that process, you're developing a proof of concept for a new type of product, service, or process, and you're um, proposing something that's high risk and early stage. And what makes it even more fundable is when you have a large and well-defined commercial opportunity, which has a game-changing impact. And then you should have done some work to show product market fit. And most of that can be done through, let's say, an ICOR program. Even the Nucleate program, Activator program, is a great example of what you can do to start gaining traction and understanding your market. So an example would be there's a company called Catalog. And Catalog, they were using synthetic DNA for data storage. They wanted to use it as a way to store massive amounts of data. And the reason why that was a good fit for the NSF SBIR was because the development process was very high risk. It was marrying um, life sciences with IT, which is very novel. And what they were proposing was proprietary technology with broad commercial applications, with potential not only in bioinformatics, but also data centers and other storage applications. So they got funded for that. Another example is a company called Sherlock Biosciences, which you may have heard. They were developing a CRISPR-based diagnostic tool for rapid detection of pathogens using paper strip diagnostics. And they had a novel platform with proprietary gene editing technology. It was all high risk, early stage when they were initially funded because they still needed to demonstrate sensitivity and specificity. And they were differentiated very well from traditional PCR tools with a clear commercial opportunity in rapid point of care diagnostics. So those are some examples of projects that were funded by the NSF, and they met all the things that the NSF was looking for. Okay, so what makes a strong proposal? So if you've done some benchtop prototype testing, if you've done some early animal models or ex vivo tissue studies, something where you have data to show that um, some early promise, that is typically a very good way to start with your phase one proposal to talk about the work you've done and the additional work you want to do in your phase one. It's really important to have a clear understanding of your target market, what the needs are that are not being met today, and what your path is to commercialization. You definitely want to talk about the customer discovery interviews you've had, potential partnerships you're looking to secure, and being a company that's successful is sometimes contingent and many times contingent on your intellectual property. So being able to show that you either have a strong IP position or you have the plan to protect your IP that you will develop during the project is key. You want to definitely talk about your clear and compelling competitive advantage and show that you have an understanding of regulatory strategy if it is applicable to your project. And lastly, what makes a strong proposal is going to be a well-rounded and capable and committed team. And to form a team, sometimes you can include advisors or consultants. Okay, so we're going to now talk about the three main areas of an NSF proposal. And these are intellectual merit, commercial potential, and broader impacts. Now, these three areas are almost equally weighted when it comes to reviewers reviewing the proposal. And that's really unique because the NSF is the only agency, the only federal agency that puts such a high emphasis on commercial potential. So it's really important that you focus on that equally as you focus on your intellectual merit and broader impacts. And we're going to talk about these three different areas of the proposal now. So, intellectual merit. Think of intellectual merit as scientific integrity and transformative potential of your innovation. So, intellectual merit is about how you're contributing to scientific or technical understanding. Are you pushing the boundaries of technology? Are you developing something new? And that's what NSF wants to see. And in that process, are you able to clearly explain what you're trying to discover or prove and why it matters? So the intellectual merit section is a place where you talk about this. You talk about why your solution is novel or non-obvious, and you need to justify why your approach makes sense. This is not a section to talk about business. Everything here is about technical discussions. For example, if you're a company that's combining, let's say, microfluidics and real-time machine learning to interpret weak biomarker signals, and you're the only company that's integrating both into a wearable patch, that's an example of something you're going to talk about, and you're going to explain why what you're doing is different from anybody else out there. NSF is funding your idea, but it's also funding you. So you want to talk about your team, talk about your PI, publications, patents, lab experience, any advisors or collaborators who fill gaps in your team. And you want to explain your technology and how you're testing it. What instruments are you going to use? What models? What lab space or partners are you going to use? And make sure in this section that you focus on explaining why this is a big leap and not just an incremental leap into a new technology or new advancement. It's very clear to articulate all those things in your intellectual merit section. So while intellectual merit tells NSF how innovative your science is, the broader impact section talks about why your work matters to society. So NSF, they want to fund technologies that make a difference. And for life science entrepreneurs, this section allows you the opportunity to talk about how your work is going to advance equity or improve health, support American jobs, maybe help with sustainability, or basically solve a systemic challenge. And so this is the section, broader impacts is the section that says, NSF, here's how our science makes lives better. And when you write this section, you want to ask yourself who ultimately benefits if this technology succeeds, and what real world outcomes will it improve? If your technology aligns with any national priorities, then you want to talk about that, like whether it's climate resilience, again, health equity, cybersecurity, and there's many national priorities that you can focus on. But the idea here also is to talk about how your company can help build technology and talent in the US. So you want to talk about how you're going to be able to grow your team, supporting diverse hiring, or even engaging STEM talent. If you're helping improve quality of life, it's important to talk about that. You know, if you're, for example, developing a diagnostic device, you could say something like, we are improving the quality of life for patients by helping them gain access to affordable early stage diagnostic tools. And that's going to help improve health outcomes and enable earlier interventions and build equity into diagnostics. So that's an example of what broader impacts is. Commercial potential is the third section that is, again, very important in the NSF's eyes. And this section gives you the opportunity to convince the NSF that your innovation is not just going to sit on the shelf. It's going to reach users, it's going to create value, and it's going to help build a high value US-based company. So you want to talk about here your target market. and show that it's big enough to justify NSF's investment. The NSF wants to see economic impact. So you're going to want to name who your end users are and explain the pain points you're solving. Explain how your solution is better, faster, or cheaper than what exists today. You're also going to talk about potential users, what their needs are, and what you've learned through customer discovery. And, and you're going to want to talk about your path to commercialization. How are you going to take this from lab to actual revenue? So NSF doesn't want to see a complete business plan at this point. You're sometimes too early to even do that, but they want to see a credible roadmap to market where you at least have an understanding of how to get there. And you can talk about potential channels for sales. It could be direct sales to hospitals, licensing to OEMs, B2B partnerships with diagnostic firms, and so on. And you're going to want to talk about what makes your solution stand out and how are you going to protect it from competition. So again, the discussion on IP is going to be very important here. How are you going to protect your IP? The reviewers do want to see somebody on your team that, or somebody close to your team that knows how to bring a product to market and has that experience. So if you don't have somebody on your team with commercialization experience, you're going to want to maybe highlight advisory board members, consultants, or anybody else who can help your company through, as you develop your technology. They also want to see that you have an understanding of your regulatory path. So having a discussion about that, if applicable, is important also. Explaining if you understand the FDA pathway and how are you going to scale your production. So that's another important discussion to focus on in commercial potential. Okay, common mistakes. So some of the common mistakes we see all the time are weak or generic problem statements, not enough, and this is a big one, not enough evidence of customer engagement and market demand, unclear technical innovation or proposing something that's more incremental or has already been solved, uh, not planning out your milestones properly or your budgets, a weak IP position, not having the right team expertise, failure to talk about your end game, your phase two vision, and then not talking about risk mitigation. So the NSF is funding you to mitigate risks. And so you need to talk about what those risks are as you're conducting your project and how you're going to mitigate them. And some tips for success, well, definitely focus on a real validated customer problem. Talk about your technical innovation and competitive edge and be very specific about it. Definitely want to show early market validation through customer discovery. ICOR program is great. The Nucleate Activator program, a lot of interviews. Having early prototype also helps. And make sure you align your team's expertise with the work that you are proposing to the NSF. And when you draft your milestone objectives for your research plan, make sure that they're quantifiable and they're clear. If you do submit a phase one proposal and you get declined, there is an opportunity to resubmit. You will receive reviewers' feedback, so you can incorporate that into your updated submission and resubmit. And many projects, they failed the first time, but they got funding the second time. So if you have the inclination to get NSF funding and your timeline supports it, use the process to get that funding. Okay, here are some references. We will be sharing these slides after this webinar is done, so you'll be able to take a look at some more information. And we actually do have time, I think, for question and answers.
Amazing.
So
Thank you so much for that incredibly informative overview. All right, we'll start by going through some of these questions. For things that are already answered that might have been asked early in the presentation, I'll just quickly answer those. So yeah, is it advisable to participate in I-Corps? Definitely. would be helpful. Not necessary. Like if you haven't done it and you want to apply, definitely still apply because there's only so many cycles. But doing something like iCore or the Activator program or other mechanisms for support is really helpful to help you validate your market and the sort of customer need. Does the PI for an SBIR need to be a PhD? That's, I guess, a question for Alap.
No, they do not need to be a PhD. And in fact, so the principal investigator can also be the business owner who is involved in the technical conduct, but they can have, as long as you have the right skill sets on your team, that's what's key.
Great. Um, does the funding phase remain the same for both SBIR STTR? Does funding distribute between NewCo and the partnering research institute? So I guess, yeah, a question about where the funding goes to what entity and how it's split for those two different paths.
Yeah, so the funding always goes to the small business, and the small business then provides a subaward to, let's say, the university, academic institution, whatever research organization or consulting firm they're working with. And there are limits, of course. So as I had mentioned, in an SBIR, the company, the small business, has to do approximately 67% of the work at a minimum and can subcontract out the rest. And in an STTR, the research institution has to do 30% of the work, and the small business at least 40% of the work.
Nice. I am not a PI at a university institution. Can I still apply?
Yes, absolutely. So the to get funding through the SBIR STTR program, the eligibility requirements are that you have to have a small business, which has to meet the SBA size standard definitions, which is less than 500 employees. The founder, I mean, the company actually, the ownership of the company needs to be greater than 51% US owned. And that means that US permanent resident or a citizen needs to own that company, more than 51% of the company. And those are the key requirements. And all the work has to be done within the US. But it's not contingent for you to be at a university or at a PI at a university.
Awesome. Um, as an international applicant, not US citizen, would someone be able to apply and participate?
You can participate as part of in an SBI or STTR program. However, if the company that's applying for the funding, again, they have to meet the eligibility requirements of having more than 51% ownership by a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. Now, the across all agencies, there has been a little bit more, I would say, careful, I guess, considerations for foreign participation, where it's becoming a little bit more stringent. So it does, depending upon what kind of work is being proposed, that's something that just needs to be taken into consideration, whether it's a DoD type project or whether it's something more generic. So it's not out of the question. Definitely, you can participate. It happens across many projects, but it just will depend on the agency. If it's not outside of NSF or even within NSF, it could possibly be.
Great. Got a question from Antonella. There's two questions. I'll try and address the first one, but correct me if that's incorrect. Asking about what are considered outside of the 30 to 50% outsourcing for SBIR. I'm assuming outsourcing means if you're outsourcing anything to a contractor, even if you're overseeing the contractor. So like not work that is not being done by a full-time employee in your place of business by the company itself would be considered outsourcing, right? And that would you can only do a certain amount of that within the funding requirements.
That is correct. Yeah, outsourcing basically means that it's not being performed by the company. You're not purchasing materials to the company. anything that's not a W-2 and that's being labor outside of the company, let's say a 1099 or a sub award, that's outsourcing.
Yep. And then the second question was, how far do most teams get with 300K for devices and drugs? This is generally only a fraction of costs. Do you have recommendations and other sources of funding as well?
So yeah, I mean, there's always the path of getting a phase 2 as well. And when you look at the phase 2 NSF SBIR, there's a higher than 50% chance of getting an SBIR phase 2. The STTR, the chances are slightly lower. So that's definitely an opportunity. The other thing you can do is go to other agencies for funding. Um, there are other non-dilutive forms. Sometimes state agencies can provide funding. There are foundations that also support funding. So there's actually quite a wide range, but it will depend upon what what area you're working in. If it's let's say cancer research or different foundations will support different types of research.
Brilliant. Let's see. So someone's asking, does the NIH have the same path to the project? NIH have the same path to the project pitch? And also just a quick plug for folks that are interested in the NIH stuff to join the later webinar series that we'll be doing about that as well. But maybe you can just briefly elaborate on how different the process would be to get to the end goal if it's NIH versus NSF.
Yeah, the NIH does not have the project pitch as the initial step. It's a straight phase 1 application. So what we recommend for NIH is to start out with a draft set of specific aims, send it to the center, the institute within the NIH that you're looking to apply to, and get feedback from them directly before you start formulating your final specific aims and your research strategy. So it is slightly different, but there is a way to make sure that you are on track and submitting something that is of value.
Great. Can you talk more about the team requirement? Do you need the full team at the application time or just assurance of what roles we are missing and the plan to build out the team?
So you need your team when you start the work. Um, Before that, if you have an idea about who's going to be participating and let's say they're not a part of your company or not contracted out, then you could still propose them.
Great. Does FedSprout offer guidance or webinars for the NIH NCI track of SBIR? Are the challenges and opportunities the same, or are there additional concerns to consider before starting the application process?
So as Oliver, as you mentioned, we're going to be doing a webinar on NIH. We are not specifically focusing on NCI, but we can kind of cover some aspects that are common with, across all institute and centers within NIH, including NCI.
Great. Someone was asking, are software tools for early drug discovery valid for the NSF?
Absolutely.
Great. You mentioned equity in the proposal, but isn't that a forbidden word with the current administration? Do you mean, yeah, did you mean equity? And yeah, you want to elaborate on that? That's obviously a sensitive topic here, how to deal with the shifting opinions of the administration, who obviously has, their thumb on the scales of how this funding is distributed.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And so, there has been definitely cuts in funding, and some of these have to do with equity and DEI, right? So when we talk about equity, so what's important is not focusing on DEI as such, but talking more about how your solution can have a broader impact. So yes, a lot of times things have to do with terminology, and if you talk around that in a sense, there's definitely going to be a higher chance of somebody not, you know, uh, taking that into consideration as a negative thing. So that's what we're advising our applicants to do.
Yeah, and in
But
some cases, there's been a pivot where the administration or kind of the language, certainly DEI as an acronym, I would advise just don't put that in there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in terms of talking about how the solution that you're creating is going to have access and sort of be equitable to a lot of different people, I think is important, right? And I think if you think about like the messaging that often comes kind of on the right from the administration, it's very much like, oh, like, we have programs to promote equity are actually like only applicable for certain parts of the population. So I think if you emphasize that like the solution that you're creating will be for everyone and it'll bring value to the entire community, specifically US, the people that live in the US, that's probably how you want to slice it.
Yeah, and if you're bringing down the cost, that increases accessibility. That's also just focus on the cost as well. Talk about that.
Exactly. Okay. Yes. So for people that applied to the FedSprout program and are waiting to hear back, you will hear back this week. We had to interview a bunch of people, so we will get back to you if you're waiting on that this week. A slide for some key deadlines. Yeah, I guess really quickly, do you want to just run over some of the very high level key deadlines for this current proposal cycle?
Yeah, I can go back here to the slide on the timeline, submission windows. So the next submission window closes July 2nd, 2025. And then right now, the current solicitation only goes through November 5th. Um, the new solicitation that will be released will then publish the next set of submission windows. I guess I'm not clear. Oliver, could you repeat that question, or is there something that specific that we should talk about?
Yeah, I think the person just wanted to be reminded. So yeah, first submission window opens September 18th. Second submission window opens November 6th. So if you're looking for the first submission window, the earliest you could apply would be September 18th. Right.
This 2024. So right now we're at in July. We're in June
Oh,
20.
sorry. I missed that. Yep, July 2025. So it's coming up. Okay. Let me look through here. Can I submit it too? Can we solicit pre-submission feedback on a draft?
On a draft proposal. No, that's what the pitch is for. The pitch is to get feedback to the NSF from the NSF.
Right. However, there are folks like FedSprout, right, that do offer services to sort of essentially provide a lot of that feedback like early on, right? So like people that work at FedSprout that are current or past reviewers of these applications can really help you look at the application as a reviewer literally would, right? And give you some of that feedback even before you get to the stage of, completing the submission. So the agencies don't do that work, but folks like FedSprout can help you out there. Does the company have to be? Yes, it does. What IP rights does an SBIR funded business give up?
None. So the nice thing about the SBIR program is that the business that is developing the IP, they own and they maintain the rights in that IP, and that's perpetual. There's something called data rights, which is slightly different, which is the data that you produce during the project. That you have a 20-year, the government gives you 20 years of protection on that data. After 20 years, they have the right to publish that data if they need to. But it's a fairly long period for most companies to gain an edge.
Great. All right, there's people have a lot of questions, which is great. Okay, so another question that kind of talks about sort of the policies of the current administration, and obviously this is, a challenge to speak to because it changes every 24 hours, but Boyan was asking if you could talk about how the new administration is affecting the focus of the submissions for the SBIR program. For example, if the technology is designed to reduce like carbon emissions from agriculture, is it going to be viewed unfavorably through the lens of climate change denialism? Are you aware of any particular areas where, you know, the funding is not going to happen, or is it literally just it changes every 24 hours? No one knows. You should submit anyways and just do your best.
Yeah, actually, we do have a slide on this, but I kind of didn't want to talk about it unless somebody asked. But so what we're recommending right now is, you know, submit whatever your idea is, because there is no clear direction from the NSF yet on what they're going to prioritize or what they're not going to be funding. Um, so, just, our recommendation is now don't worry about that. It's not there's no way for us to know right now. Maybe in a few months we may get a better understanding. But if you're looking to get funding, just you know, unless you're willing to wait, submit your proposal with whatever you're planning to do, just submit that.
Yep. Great. Right, so I'm just looking through trying to find the most relevant questions.
One thing I should mention
Okay,
is
go
there is
ahead.
a proposal to reduce the NSF funding by 50%. That's in the latest budget. We don't know if that's going to come about, but if it does, if there is cuts to NSF funding, that will reduce the amount of available SBIR, STTR funding, which will make this a more competitive program. So it's really important that if you still want NSF funding, you're going to want to make sure that you have a top-notch proposal. All right.
100%.
Yeah.
There's a question about confidentiality. If you want to be a stealth company, is that compatible with SBIR funding application disclosure? So I guess can you talk a little bit about at what point does your application become published or is considered public disclosure, or is it always not that and you can apply at any time without concerns?
So there are, in terms of the project review, the proposal review, the NSF program director has access to your proposal as well as there's a panel of experts that look at it as well. They're all under confidentiality obligations, so they cannot disclose it to anybody. Now, one thing that does happen is somebody may come in and submit a FOIA request to access your proposal. At that point, you will be informed, and you have the opportunity to then black out portions of your application that you believe are confidential before that goes out um, to the requester. Now, this process of FOIA, it's subjective, and sometimes the NSF does not provide these proposals, and sometimes they do. But one thing you can do is to mark certain portions of your proposal as confidential.
Great. Okay. Particular areas. I guess last question, just because we have too many questions to answer, but I think this would be a good note to end on. Someone had asked if you can repeat the common mistakes slide one more time. And I guess if you want to just sort of say what are those common mistakes, and then if there are any kind of last parting words of wisdom that you'd like to give the folks on the crowd, that would be a good way for us to wrap up.
Absolutely. So here are the common mistakes. Again, you really want to clearly define the problem that you're tackling. And again, that problem is based on also the customer discovery that you've done. You want to show that whatever problem you're trying to solve is actually a real problem. And so, and then also doing the right amount of, I guess, as market sizing. So being able to say, okay, this is how large of a market we have. Clearly spelling all that out is really key. And some people don't do that, and a lot of people give less focus to the commercial potential section. And then in terms of your innovation, again, what's really key is it's got to be novel, proprietary technology, something that usually hasn't ever been done before. So spelling all that out is important, and making sure that you're definitely proposing something unique. Quantifiable milestones or budgets that are realistic. That those are, sometimes people overpromise or underpromise. We got to be positioned. Having a team with gaps isn't a good thing. Not talking about your phase two vision, what your overall plan is to commercialize your commercialization roadmap, and talking about how you're going to mitigate risks. Those are some important things to do. Okay, Oliver, any other questions? I have I just want to mention one thing before we hang up here.
No, I don't think any other questions, and I'll just want to thank everyone for coming, and please pass it off to Alip to close the meeting.
All right, thanks, Oliver. So again, just a reminder, in a week's time, same day, same time, we're going to have a 1 hour webinar that goes into more depth about how to write a successful proposal for the NSF SBIR STTR program. And then, there were a lot of questions today, and I'm sure we weren't able to get to all of them. But if you do want to talk, we can offer a free one-to-one consultation. There's a link here in the slides which you can access. And Oliver, I guess if you have that, you could also drop it into the chat if you haven't.
Yeah,
But
what did you email it to me, right? I'll just quickly find it and drop it into the chat for people. Yes, the one-on-one consultation. Definitely take advantage of this if you're on the call and you're thinking about submitting a proposal. You will, if you thought this webinar was informative, awesome. But if you do the one-on-one, you'll be able to get very specific feedback about your proposal, and that'll hopefully help you guys get some funding.
great. Well, I want to thank everybody who joined this webinar. Hopefully it was useful. And just to wrap up, thanks Oliver, and thanks to the Nucleate team for allowing us to present. And have a great day.